this question is interesting. It says, what does an employee's obligation to mitigate financial loss look like during a pandemic? For example, an obligation to agree to a workshare, agree to a temporary layoff to seek emergency benefits, the obligation to agree to reduced hours that otherwise be considered constructive dismissal. How will the pandemic affect the reasonable notice period for those with the wrongful dismissal claim after and during the pandemic? All good questions. Chris has touched on this a bit, but I want to give you my thoughts about one of the big issues employers faced when all of a sudden a whole bunch of people are laid off, right? We had to take it out of the pandemic concept and realize that in the normal course, if you lay off somebody, absent an agreement, pretty clear, it's probably a constructive dismissal. So the employee can say, hey, that's the same as firing me. I'm out of here. I want damages for reasonable notice, etc. They also may have looked at the Employment Standards Act provincially that said if you lay off somebody, a temporary layoff, 13 weeks out of 20, it's automatically back to the first day a termination, in which case Section 63 individual termination severance pay and potentially Section 64, which are group terminations. And these are really big numbers when you're talking big numbers. So my advice and Chris's advice is that we think the concept, this legal concept of frustration of contract, where the courts, human rights tribunals, and indeed even the Employment Standards Act build in a concept that says, look, if your inability to perform the contract, i.e. provide work, if it is absolutely impossible for unforeseen circumstances to do, it's not that you have dismissed anybody, it's just that it's gone away. The substratum of the contract has gone away, okay? So hard concept to prove in employment. We see that in wrongful dismissal mostly the other way, where the employee is absent for a long period of time. The employer is arguing that they didn't dismiss, the contract just came to an end. Under the statute, Section 65(1)(d) builds in that concept, says there's no severance pay owing under 63 or 64. Don't worry about it if you can prove this concept. Impossible to perform the contract due to unforeseen or circumstances. The problem there is, all of a sudden your major customer goes away. Are you going to be protected? No. But my view is this: the pandemic is the pandemic. It is the entire enchilada, and that's going to govern everything. How can a court say that my contract that required, I had to lay off 50 people because I got no work immediately? My restaurant shut down, or I got an order, or I just, I'm a dentist and I can't perform my work. How can the courts, who themselves are shut down, you can't get access to the courts. A criminal's not going to get his day in court. So it's going to be hard for them to say, yeah, well, we weren't subject to that, but you are. I think that's the problem. And so all you plaintiff lawyers running around out there looking for the great wagon of wrongful dismissal cases, you're going to be in for a bit of a fight. One final point on that: governments across the land are taking a look at their employment standards. Alberta is looking at extending the temporary leave to 6 months. Many of us think that just puts out the problem down the road, because 6 months, if you're not back up and running, you may be hammered. I think the fact that people are back on wage subsidy, I think that protects you. I think that people that agree after a couple of months, if you're carrying on benefits, for example. So I think there's a lot of arguments in favor of employers to fight off these potential claims. One thing that I didn't answer, I don't think, in that two-part question, was what happens if there's a legitimate wrongful dismissal, like it doesn't fit into all of the little things that we're talking about. You just fired Ralphie and he's out the door, and you don't have a written employment agreement that limits his damages. The question was, well, what about the notice period? And the answer is, I think the maximum notice period of 24 months will still maintain. I don't think that's going to change. Supreme Court of Canada has made it pretty clear, and Ontario has made it clear it's not going above that. But here's what's going to happen. In 1980 and 81, for those that remember, BC Hydro let go 100 engineers all in one day. And you can imagine how specialized that skill is and how likely those guys were going to get a job. As a result, a bunch of wrongful dismissal cases came out called Ansari, and they were all done by the former Chief Justice, Al McKeon. And he gave a pretty high level of notice period if you go back and look at it, based on the 4 criteria of age, length of service, availability of similar alternate employment, et cetera. So, yeah, it's going to pump it up a bit because the person's not likely going to get a job, and then, of course, be really difficult to mitigate. The other case is a case called Hunter and Northwood Pulp, which basically said he was let off in the 80s in the forest industry when it was in the dumps. And the Court of Appeal said, well, we can take economic circumstances into account to maybe bump up the notice period, not to bump it down, but to bump it up. But it can't be given undue influence. So the answer is yes, it's probably going to be higher numbers.